All right, let's just jump right in. We're going to talk about something fascinating: how just a few words, a single phrase, can build an entire moral universe, especially when it comes to one of the most polarizing debates of our time. But really, what this is all about is the sheer power of language itself.
So just take a look at these two phrases. On one hand, you have a protest sign, just a clump of cells. On the other, a social media post. Can't wait to meet you, baby. Now, think about it. They're both talking about the exact same biological process, right? Human gestation. But wow, do they create two completely different realities? One makes it sound like, formless, disposable matter. The other, it's about a person, someone to love, someone you can't wait to meet. How can two simple phrases be so worlds apart? That's really the question we're going to try and unpack here.
Okay, so before we get any deeper, I want to make something really clear. The goal here isn't to pick a side or say who's right or wrong in the abortion debate. Not at all. Instead, think of us as, I don't know, linguistic detectives. We're going to focus on the source materials analysis of how the game is played. How the words are chosen, how they're used to construct the entire battlefield in the first place. So here's our roadmap. We're going to look at how words build worlds. Then we'll dive into the clash between science and semantics, see how language shapes the law, and then how it's used on the rhetorical battlefield. Finally, we'll ask a really important question. What's the actual price of a word? All right, first step, science versus semantics. We're diving into what biology actually reveals and what our language sometimes tries to hide. If you look at this from a purely biological angle, what you see is a story of just incredible, rapid change. Get this. By day 22, a heart has already formed and is beating. Just a few weeks later, week 6, you can actually detect electrical brain activity. And by week 12, we're talking coordinated movement, facial features are starting to emerge. The sources we're looking at are really clear on this. These aren't opinions, these are just documented biological milestones. And then you get the complete opposite. The source points out that a phrase like tissue mass isn't some neutral scientific term, not even close. It's a really powerful rhetorical choice. The analysis calls it a semantic demotion. It's basically a way of framing this incredibly dynamic living organism as something, well, inert, no different than, say, a tumor or any other bit of tissue you could remove. This brings us to a really key psychological concept that comes from the work of psychologist Nick Haslam. It's called mechanistic dehumanization. Now, this isn't about calling something an animal. It's something different. It's when you frame a being as just an object, a machine, or simply matter. It completely strips away any sense of life, of agency, and that makes it psychologically way easier to just disregard. So, you might be asking, why is this kind of language so effective? Well, the analysis points to this psychological process called moral disengagement, and it's basically a 3-step mental trick we play on ourselves. Step 1 is euphemistic labeling, using a term like products of conception to rename something that might be harmful. This helps with step 2, redirecting our attention. We start focusing on the justification for the act, not the act itself. And what's the end result? Step 3. It reduces our own psychological discomfort. It kind of protects our image of ourselves as moral people, even when we're making a really tough choice. Okay, so what happens when this kind of language moves out of the public square and into the courtroom? Well, that brings us to our next section, language in the law. This is where these abstract words get formalized. They get written down, and they're given the full power and authority of the state. I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court itself has spent decades, literally decades, trying to figure out what to call the unborn. Back in 1973 with Roe v. Wade, it came up with the legal term potential life. Then, almost 20 years later, Casey v. Planned Parenthood shifted the goalpost to viability, which is a moving target, right? It totally depends on the latest technology. And then, much more recently, the Dobbs decision basically stepped back from the whole thing, creating what the source calls a constitutional silence. It just handed the power to define all this back to the states. And this really gets to the core of the source's legal analysis. That term, potential life, it was never a scientific one. According to this framework, it was more like a juridical shield, a legal placeholder, really, designed to sidestep all that ethical discomfort. It allowed the court to build a legal framework without having to answer the fundamental biological question at the heart of it all. So that brings us right back to the public square, where all these scientific, psychological, and legal ideas get turned into weapons. Slogans, campaign ads, the whole shebang. And here you can just see the two opposing toolkits laid out side by side. On one side, you have the lexicon of minimization, using these cold, clinical, abstract terms to reduce the moral weight of the issue. On the other side, the lexicon of rehumanization, using familiar, personal words like baby to crank it way up. The key thing the analysis points out is that none of this is by accident. Both are very deliberate strategies, designed to win the moral argument before it even really begins. And this strategy of rehumanization, it goes way beyond just picking the right words. The research shows it's a full-on sensory and emotional campaign. You've got technology like ultrasounds, making the invisible visible. You have fetal models to create a real, physical, tactile connection. And then you have the power of personal stories and scientific timelines, all working together to build a case for personhood that hits you on both an emotional and a scientific level. So, after all this, what's the final cost? What's the price we pay for this war of words? The source material we're looking at suggests it has some pretty profound consequences for our entire culture. So the core argument is basically this. When we consistently use this sort of sanitized, mechanistic language, we risk just numbing ourselves. It's like creating a kind of moral anesthesia. It lets us off the hook from having to confront really difficult truths or sit with uncomfortable gray areas. The language does the heavy lifting for us, ethically speaking, often by just pretending one part of the equation doesn't exist. And that leads us to what is really the central thesis of this entire analysis. It's the idea that words aren't just passive little labels we stick on things. Not at all. They are the active architecture of our thought. They are the very blueprints we use to construct our reality. They literally build what we can see, what we can feel, and what we decide matters morally. And so we're left with this final, really provocative question. It's asking us to look past the slogans, to look past the talking points, and to really think about the foundation that we are laying with the language we choose. Because if our words build our moral reality, what world are we building? No matter where you stand on the issue, it forces you to stop and think about the incredible power and the profound responsibility that comes with every single word we choose.